Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I've got a really interesting young lady to introduce you to tonight who's an author. She's a publicist, and she's a radio host. And so she's got a really interesting background. Hollay Ghadery is an Iranian-Canadian writer living here in Ontario. She has her MFA in creative writing from the University of Guelph, which I presume is a Master's of Fine Arts. Is that correct?
Correct.
Fuse, her memoir of mixed race identity and mental health, was released in 2021 and won the 2023 Canadian Book Club Award for nonfiction memoir. Her collection of poetry, Rebellion Box, came out in 2023, and her collection of short fiction, Widow Fantasies, is scheduled for release with Gordon Hill Press in the fall of 2024. She's the poetry editor with Long Con Magazine and a host of Howl on CIUT 89.5 FM and the 105.5 Hits FM Book Club. She's also the poet laureate of Scugog Township. What the heck is the poet laureate of Scugog Township?
Yeah, well, Scugog Township is a little township in Durham region. And I was born in Toronto and stayed there for, a bit of my life. But around grade 5, I moved to this little area. And Scugog Township is this lovely little township that's on Lake Scugog and has this very vibrant and supportive arts community. Like just full of talented people, full of some of the best artists in the country. And in with the township, the Scugog Arts, they got together and they created this position for a poet laureate of Scugog Township. So my job is to bring poetry to the people and show how poetry can be a part of our everyday lives. And it already is, whether we acknowledge it or not. But to show people how poetry can help us, how poetry can be used for expression, how poetry can help us celebrate our community. So that is my job.
Sounds great. And I understand that April is National Poetry Month. So we might come back a little bit later and talk a little bit about poetry. But I want to write, if I could, write to this book, Fuse, that won the big award. And you have been, it's been said about you that your writing centers around uncompromising openness and sharing of some of the most personal experiences that you've encountered. Why are you so open, and why is it important for you to be so open?
Because being quiet almost killed me. I think silence can kill people when we feel that things are too taboo or that we're ashamed of parts of our lives that are really just part of the human experience. And we'll start to feel guilty about it. And as soon as we start to feel shame about things and hiding things, I think that kind of does a number on us internally. And I know I suffered from it because I felt like I couldn't talk to anyone about what I was going through. And not only could I not talk to anyone, I didn't even have the language to do it. I didn't even know how. So when I wrote Fuse, it's a book that I often say I wrote it in, started it in my early 30s. And I don't think I could write it again. I wouldn't be in the space to ever feel that kind of desperate vulnerability that I felt back then. But I did. And I think why I wrote it and why I was so open and why I continue to be so open is because silence kills people and silence hurts people. And that's not saying that we have to give every single part of our lives away to people. We're under no obligation to disclose anything, perhaps unless it's vital to some kind of criminal investigation that we don't want to disclose. But I think that, if we could be a little bit more open with each other, we'd start to find more common humanity and less division. So I felt like, go ahead.
How did not being open almost kill you?
So I struggled with eating disorders. I was an alcoholic for many years, and I live with obsessive compulsive disorder, body dysmorphia, and there was so much stigma around these things that I just kind of clamped down and didn't talk about them. And, I wasn't brought up in a culture or a society, I should say, where people were really, encouraging people to end the stigma or, anything like that. That wasn't, I was born in the 80s, grew up 80s and 90s. And, people were still pretty shh, don't talk about these things. If you're struggling, don't talk about it. It's embarrassing. It's embarrassing to your family. And, especially, in the Iranian culture, I really found, it was certainly not to be discussed, these
And
personal.
is that what Fuse is about?
Yeah, it's about being biracial and bicultural. So, growing up between these disparate cultures and these completely different expectations, especially for women, like in Western culture, you're allowed, or I felt like I was allowed a lot more freedom in some ways, but Western culture has its own issues. And then I was, brought up Islamic as well. And, then my family internally had like its own set of expectations on me. And I felt very divided between the two sets of expectations and really had no sense of who I was supposed to be or how I was supposed to be. And then I also had these mental illnesses, the anxiety, the OCD, which I first started encountering when I was very young. And while, I have a chemical composition that I would have had OCD arguably no matter what, the environment in which I was raised certainly didn't make it any better.
Was it helpful writing the book?
The book was actually just very terrifying. I think what was helpful was all the work I did before I wrote the book. So like the therapy, the, figuring things out, getting sober, all that was very helpful. Writing the book to me is like a very different thing from doing the work, all the cathartic work of making yourself better. What helped with writing the book, I can say, was that I felt less alone. Is that I thought I assumed I wasn't the only one that was going through these things, but this book came out and I realized that I am absolutely, even people who were brought up, maybe not Iranian and white, different mixes of being mixed race, or just simply, very Catholic Italian in Canada. People, had the same issues between their internal culture at home and what was expected of them, and then what was expected of them in the world that they stepped out into every day.
What a fascinating story you've got. I didn't realize we were going to get into these issues. I thought you were just a great author, but this is really quite interesting. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back with Hollay in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Hollay Ghadery. She's a Iranian-Canadian writer. She's written a compelling book called Fuse that won Canada Book Club Awards last year. And she's just been talking a little bit about it and some of the experiences that she had in her own life and challenges that she had in her own life that created the story behind, I guess, that book. Hollay, I'm a firm believer that everyone has a signature story, is what I call it, a thing that makes them who they are. And often it is a negative story, regrettably. It's something that happened to them that was problematic, but they found their way through it, and that ends up being the definition of who they are, because they found the strength to get through it. What do you think? Is this your signature story?
Definitely. I mean, there's Fuse is a memoir in meditations on mixed race identity and mental illness. So it's not like there's this linear narrative where you start at the beginning of my life and go to where I am now. It kind of jumps all over the place, but these stories that I've included in Fuse, yeah, I mean, they all have the commonality of that overarching theme of mixed race mental health. But all of them are. I go back to them frequently and quite. I don't actually like read the book again. It feels kind of weird to do that. But even in my mind, when I go back to them, yes, it's been incredibly foundational for me. But it almost seems unreal that I was ever that person too. Sometimes I feel very close to that person, and other times it's like, wow, why would I ever do that, or why did that happen, or how was that even possible? It seems incredibly unreal.
So how did you get through the body issues, the alcoholism, some of these mental health issues that you had?
Um, well, I mean, with support, I'm my partner is an absolutely wonderful person, and while he has never experienced any of the things that I experienced firsthand, he's very just calm, stable person. I always say that he's like this massive grizzly bear and I'm this hummingbird that's just constantly flitting around the place. So just, his completely uncompromising and unwavering love. Like he married me as an addict and he was not, and he knew what I was. And, so just finding uncompromising, unjudgmental love definitely helped. But obviously that's not a solution. That was just a tool. There's a really great quote from, she wrote Old Woman at Play, and now her name's escaping me, but Adele Wiseman. And she says, paraphrasing here, that one thing about artists that she's noticed is that we retain images or parts of ourselves from everybody we used to be, from our childhood self, all this. So for me, what actually really helped was just remembering when I was very, very young, before everything had happened, like 4, 5, 6, what I used to love about the world, and trying to kind of re-enchant my life with the purity and enthusiasm I had as a very young child. And I have 4 children, 4 very young children. So just kind of grounding myself in childhood and wonder and re-enchantment and nature and all of these things like helped me. I had a lot of sobriety capital, though. There's a lot of people who are addicts who have had absolutely horrible lives from the get-go and don't have that capital that I had. My parents may not have been perfect, but they loved me a lot. I have a lot of very wonderful childhood to like tap into, to remember what I loved about life, and how that before I started, being an alcoholic, or I mean, arguably you're always an alcoholic, but before that happened, I had a lot of hard times, but I got through them without alcohol. So I kind of had to go back and remember how to deal with my life. And with the eating disorders and stuff like that, it's an ongoing process, to be honest. Every now and then I'll have like a little like, oh, wow, that's not a healthy way to think about food. Or, recently my doctor told me, because I keep getting sick, that I'm too stressed out and I need to take 2 weeks off working out and just do walking and gentle yoga. And I feel like I can't breathe because I can't work out. And that's a very disordered way of looking at your body and your life. I feel like I'm worthless if I'm not, burning 1,000 calories a day at the gym. Like that's an ongoing battle for me.
Fascinating. So I haven't heard this term sobriety capital before. What is sobriety capital?
Yeah, I'm not sure if that's like the correct term, to be honest. It's just the term I use in my head, but it's the experiences you have in your life before you were actively an addict that you can draw on to help form your sobriety. So again, if somebody's grown up in a situation where, from the moment they were born, it's just been awful, born into unfortunate circumstances, born into systemic failure and injustice, they might not have a lot of sobriety capital to draw on. I was very lucky. I had a whole lot. I've been very loved all my life, despite everything. And what I really try to do, infuse, and what 99.9% of readers have said, and I'm so grateful for, despite the fact my parents have never read the book and don't want to read the book, is that I never throw my parents under the bus. I never say, hey, this was your fault. I never, it's not. Everyone, I'm a mother of 4 myself. I mean, you do the best. Most parents are doing the best they can.
This book is about you?
Fuse, yes.
And how you got through the problems, or what the problems were. Tell me a little bit about the book.
Yeah, so it's not really meant to like solve anything. It's meant to interrogate the issues. So it started because a therapist many moons ago, when I was in my mid-20s, I went to I lived in Kingston, Ontario at the time, and I went to one therapy session because my boyfriend at the time kind of pressured me to, for my eating disorder. And she said there's a documented prevalence of eating disorders in biracial women. That's where it all started. I wasn't even in my master's yet. And I thought, who is this quack? I'm not listening to you. I don't even want to be here. I'm hungover. Like, I just want to be out of here. And the stories included. I kind of brushed it off, but that kind of always stuck with me, that that was something that I needed to think about. So these essays just interrogate different parts of being biracial, bicultural, of living with mental illness. And each one does something different. And, it doesn't, again, it's not linear. We start at me and my daughter, my oldest daughter, are going to see the new one, what was the new Wonder Woman movie when it came out, and me discussing how I felt about the casting of Wonder Woman, because, I was always thought that Amazons were these like very strong women. And I always thought of, I used to read comic books as a child. I always thought of Wonder Woman as this like kind of more substantial character. And then you have Gal Gadot come in, who is beautiful. And I know that muscle size is not indicative of muscle strength, but she epitomizes a very narrow view of feminine beauty. And I was like really looking forward to seeing a different kind of body that I could relate to. And instead I would just found myself sitting there watching this, just so upset, because Hollywood, not that you expect much from Hollywood, had this opportunity to show young girls, a different kind of strength and beauty, and they kind of just went with the same old. So it starts with that, and then it gets into when I decided that I should be an escort and apply to live at a brothel. And like at my worst times, it gets into having my children. It gets into meeting my partner. It gets into tons of different, my father didn't come to my wedding. And then the day after my wedding, basically I was disowned, didn't even see me until about 6 weeks after my first child was born. It gets into all these different things, but hopefully without assigning blame, just kind of exploring and interrogating how this all happened and maybe why this is all happening. And different, I think there's like 14 different essays.
You worked as an escort?
I tried to. I don't want to give anything away, but I thought, because in Iranian culture, it's a very like angel or whore dichotomy. Women can either be angels or you're a whore. There's like no gray area, just to be human in the middle. And I grew up with all this like, oh, you're every girl's a whore. She wears a crop top, she's a whore. She wears short shorts, she's a whore. Like there was this very conservative and damaging view of the female body and who women are. And I was an addict, very, very low in my addiction at that point, and desperate for money. I'd been cut off from my family, and I decided that I needed to make money. And since I'd always been told I was a whore, then might as well. So I went to a brothel, or it wasn't a brothel, it was an escort service. And and I applied to work there. But I don't want to give anything away. People can read the book. But it was one of the lower points in my life, but also looking back, probably a very foundational point too.
Why would there be this high incidence of eating disorders with biracial, bicultural people?
Again, it's that pull, that tension between, the expectations, the bodily expectations. So, I talk about it a little bit in my book, but like if you have like a Iranian expectation on the female body, which is like modest and conservative and not so fixated necessarily when I was growing up on thinness. And then it's probably different now, but you had the 90s expectation of girls where you had to be like heroin chic or nothing. It's not like the same expectation. You're constantly being torn and pulled between different expectations of different cultures. If you look at the idealization of feminine beauty in, Chinese culture, and then the expectation of female beauty in some cultures in Africa, and Africa is a huge place with many different cultures and many different, but they're often quite different things. And then you put these two things together and tell girls, make girls pick sides, or supposed to look a certain way, but of course our genes express themselves however they're going to express themselves. So for me, for instance, I got a nose job when I was in my early teens because I grew up I was born in Toronto, but then I moved out to small town Ontario, and I didn't look like all the white girls around me, and I hated it. Like, I hated my name. I wish I could just be called Sarah or Victoria. I hated that, like, my nose was so big. I hated that I like was getting like facial hair all over, like a lot of Iranian girls do. And I really didn't feel like I had anywhere to fit in. I wasn't white enough to be white, and I wasn't Iranian enough to be Iranian. And it kind of internalized with this fixation on my body, and how who I was and the way I was not enough.
So you were disowned by your family. You were an addict. You were so low at one point in time in your life that you considered being an escort, but yet you got a master's in fine arts and became an author. How
Yeah.
how did that all happen?
Well, thank God the arts, the arts celebrate our differences, right? Like, the with the arts, your weaknesses, or not, I don't even want to say weaknesses. What makes you different in the arts is often what makes you valuable. And the way that you see the world, if it's different, if it diverges, if you can see something or experience something that other people can't, I mean, that's a good thing. If you can tap into the truth, many different truths of our world. So that didn't necessarily stop me. And I loved doing my master's. The MFA program at Guelph is just incredible, and I love the people I was surrounded by, and I found a really encouraging, wonderful environment. Did it stop me from being an addict or having an eating disorder? Absolutely not. It's never one thing. It's a series of things that usually gets people sober and helps them toward getting better. I don't like I despise actually the recovery narrative. Like, you get sober and everything's fixed, or that there's like an end to healing. There's no end. It's like an ongoing process. It just gets easier. So yeah, I definitely have always had a lot of like drive. That wasn't the issue. It was it even when I was, even when I was using drugs or an alcohol, I was definitely still writing, just not very well. So getting sober helped me write. For instance, I didn't finish my first book until I got sober. I may have written a lot of it when I wasn't sober, but it was mostly garbage. I didn't get, like, nothing happened in my writing life until after I got sober, which was 8 years ago.
Did you go to rehab? Did you go to AA, therapy? What was it that got you through it?
I definitely don't recommend this for most people. Most people need more external support than I had. For me, I went to AA a handful of times, but Jesus isn't everybody's Jesus. It didn't work for me. I didn't find it helpful. I found reliving these really horrible experiences wasn't helpful for me. Therapy, I did have a therapist, and she was helpful. Didn't see her as much as I should have. I did not go to rehab. Really, it was a point where I was having some very severe and aggressive suicidal ideation. And I told myself in that moment, like, I already had 3 kids at this point, and I told myself that I was going to, like, I wanted to die. I wanted to kill myself. I didn't want to live like this anymore. And I can remember sitting there in my living room and saying to myself, okay, you're going to give yourself 1 year. 1 year, you're going to give up all of this. Just 1 year, you're going to believe in the world the way you used to believe in the world when you were a child. You're going to harness that. You're going to dip into the ether of your childhood self. And after 1 year, if life is terrible, if everything is absolute crap, then you can go back to drinking and drink yourself to death for all I care. But you're going to give yourself 1 year where you believe like you have never believed before that this is going to be okay. I was just at this low point, and I kind of struck that bargain with myself in that one moment, gave it up on the spot, and never went back. After, a few weeks, I felt so much better. That's not to say that there wasn't temptation. That wasn't to say that I didn't struggle sometimes, but I didn't have this like white knuckle experience of, oh, I'm going to go back to drinking, because I think if you can, again, have that sobriety capital and you can tap back into happy times in your life and realize there was a time that you could get by without the drug, that's incredibly helpful and powerful to help you move beyond it.
Why'd your husband marry you if you had all these problems?
I mean, that's a really good question. I ask him all the time. I mean, I think it comes down to that he saw who I was despite it, because it wasn't like I was drunk 24/7. Like, it wasn't that at all. I mean, I had children in this time. There were periods where I was like forced to be sober, and that kind of thing. So like he saw who I was, and didn't what he didn't he didn't think my illness was me, and was kind of above, and like just infuriatingly but touchingly free from any kind of concern that anybody else thought of me or of him or of anything. So even in his daily life, things that would bother most people, he actually just doesn't care. He has this really cosmic ambivalence to, just the things in everyday life that bother most of us. So I guess that's it. He saw me for me, and he's refreshingly detached from everyday concerns, I guess.
Has he read your book?
Yes, he has. He was one of my first readers. So
And what does he think about it?
I mean, he loves it. He thinks it's great. He's in it a little bit, or probably a lot. We discussed the fact in it that, like, when I married him, I was like, that, very difficult things, that like he's the gardener in the relationship and I'm the flower. And I've always felt like he loves me more than I love him. And I always think there's something wrong with me. And he's like, well, I don't care. I don't care that I love you more. I'm fine with that. He doesn't really have ego attached to us or my book. And he was very open to me writing about anything I wanted to. And thankfully, my children were incredibly young when I wrote this book. So not only do I not like throw them under the spotlight, but there was, it's not like I'm writing about teenagers where they might have a problem with what I write about them. In this case, I mean, my children have read it, and or I've read it to them, and they know what it says, and they're absolutely unbothered by it. My children delight in the fact they are in this book. And like with my first son, if I hadn't become pregnant with him, which was a very big surprise, I probably wouldn't be with my husband. I was that kind of, I know you don't have to be married to have a child, but again, grew up quite conservative and was kind of like forced into marriage. I mean, I don't know if I'd still be with him. I don't know if I'd be sober. I always tell my first son that he saved my life. And
It sounds like an absolutely excellent book. How do I get one?
You can get it anywhere books are sold, absolutely anywhere. But I'm always one for supporting your local independent bookstore, wherever you are. Call up your independent bookstore, order it.
And the name of it?
Fuse.
Fuse by
Fuse.
Hollay Ghadery.
Yeah.
We're going to take a break for some messages and come back with Hollay in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Hollay Ghadery. She's an Iranian-Canadian author. She's written a book that got some big awards last year called Fuse. It's about the challenges that she encountered as she was growing up in a biracial, bicultural existence, family, and encountered significant mental health issues. And we've been chatting about some of these. Hollay, could you read a passage from the book for us, potentially?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll read from the title essay called Fuse. Girls are dying, but it doesn't happen all at once. The therapist searched my file. Which one of your parents is Iranian? She was pulling out my intake questionnaire. The form had taken me longer to complete than our session would last. I registered through the outpatient program at the hospital, and after 3 months of waiting, I received a phone call letting me know I had an appointment scheduled for the following week. It's just that women who are biracial are prone to eating disorders, she explained. I nodded. I didn't ask why. I hadn't cared, but when she told me this, I jerked my spine straight, grinning and shrugging loosely and dumbly as a marionette. This happened 14 years ago. I was 24, and it was the first time I'd been to a therapist. I was only there because my boyfriend wanted me to talk to someone, and I would have done anything for him. And people with eating disorders are more likely to suffer from co-occurring diseases like depression, anxiety, and substance abuse, she continued, flipping through my paperwork. And OCD, I see you've been diagnosed. My eyes darted back to her. I'd been staring at the scuffed baseboards in her office, which I was pretty sure was or had been a storage closet. I was hungover trying to piece together my surroundings. It gave me a small measure of comfort to be able to order my world there, since I couldn't remember how I'd gotten home the night before. I know there'd been live music in a dive bar. There were many vodka and Diet Cokes. I remember giving a hair tie to a girl who'd been throwing up in the bathroom. She offered me a slurred thanks and said she usually doesn't drink that much. I told her I usually drink till I'm hot. Ha ha. We both thought I was pretty funny. Focus, I reminded myself, shuffling my feet under my chair. My jeans were digging into my hips. It was 2005 and low-waisted bottoms were still a trend, to the despair of anyone with a body mass index above 23. Focus, I told myself again. I've repeated the word over and over until the swarm in my head condensed into a dull throb and until I could clear a space to take something in. The office had brown stains spread across white drop ceiling, boxes crammed into corners. One was holding a bouquet of fluorescent lights, another a tangle of extension cords. The therapist was still talking. You were diagnosed with OCD, she repeated. The system that gives names. When you were 13, that gives me Brillo pad brains. The comorbidity of these diseases is well documented, she continued when I didn't answer. I was not sure I'd even blinked. My eyes felt dry, my skin dry, my tongue cracked and impossible. Let's leave it there.
I really want to read this book. Sounds really fascinating. And the fact that you've gotten through all of this and you're excelling now is amazing. So, congratulations and thank you for being open and sharing. You've now written a book about poetry, Rebellion Box, and it's all about Uxbridge. Why would you go and how would you go from writing about, this incredible personal tragedy and life to writing poems about Uxbridge?
Yeah, first of all, I always considered myself a poet. The memoir was something I never intended to happen. It just did. So I always thought I went to my MFA for poetry. So poetry was supposed to be the thing I did. But not all the poems are about Uxbridge. They're just very heavily rooted in Uxbridge. And the reason for that is, first of all, I think there's this misconception that all art happens in cities. And that's like these throbbing hubs of artistic genius where, there's so much that happens in small towns, in rural areas. There's so much richness and so many interesting people who live in rural areas. And it wasn't intentional. It just happens to be where I live or around the area that I live. And I was really interested in local people and local characters. So the title poem of the collection in Rebellion Box is actually, it won the Nick Blatchford Award for Occasional Verse, which is very cool. And it's a sestina, which is a very kind of old French style of poem about Joseph Gould, who was one of the founders of Uxbridge and a Quaker who he didn't really fight, but he was involved in the rebellion of 1837 in Ontario. And I heard a story about him at a local lecture series, and I was just fascinated. And I, thought, he's so different from me. He was a Quaker. He was this straight white man. Like, what do I have in common with him? But just the kind of human experience that he went through felt so deeply. So I felt so connected to it that I wanted to explore, and I researched him further. And I wrote this poem about him.
You're now, as well, the founder of River Street Writing, a boutique book publicity and author support services that's known for its community building. Why did you get from writing a book about your tragedies and challenges to writing a book about poetry in Uxbridge to now being a publicity service and community building service for authors?
Yeah, it all feels the same to me. A lot of the things that are discussed in Rebellion Box, which has a lot to do with that kind of like feeling frustrated and impotent in your own life, that has a lot to do with what I discussed in Fuse. Like the themes are all still there. It's just a different form and a different way of exploring it. And then I worked for 20 years, I've worked as like a communication specialist. And I did work in corporate America for a while. And then last year I had this moment of, just being like, I don't want to do this anymore. I just want to do something that matters with my life. Like, I'm not getting any younger. I want to do something that brings me joy. I spoke to a very good friend of mine, Lucy Black, who you've actually interviewed here. And she convinced me that I should use my publicity powers, which I'd been using for years already, for small presses in Canada. And I'm already like, I'm a huge reader. I was a reader before I was a writer. And I couldn't believe I didn't think of it myself. And there's this massive um, market, and there's this massive opportunity for someone to help people who are published by small presses in Canada. So you have the multinationals like Penguin Random House, all that stuff. But then you do have the smaller presses who are consistently producing amazing literature, who are winning international awards, who are still traditionally published, but they don't have the marketing might of the multinationals. So they're publishing books that are just as good, if my opinion, not better than a lot of the stuff being published by the big presses, but they don't have as much support. So that is where I came in. And I already knew a lot of the editors of these presses from being published, from doing my MFA. So it felt like a very natural extension. And the community part is that, sales and marketing and stuff are great, but ultimately it's readers who buy books and who read books. So I was more interested in kind of hanging out with my fellow readers and talking about amazing books and creating meaningful and lasting relationships between authors and readers. And I wasn't as concerned with the vanity metrics and the vanity accomplishments of necessarily getting a book reviewed in a certain place, although obviously that's great. Getting book reviews in newspapers is wonderful and you should do them, but I was more focused on helping readers find books they love and helping authors find their readers. And I think one of the best ways to do that, being someone who's often felt very disconnected and alone, is to draw a huge circle, a very porous circle, where people can come and talk and be welcomed and not judged. And that's what River Street is. It's this place where readers and authors can connect.
Well, you've introduced me to some great authors, and so thank you for that. If there are some authors out there that want to explore your services, how do they contact you?
They can do it through riverstreetwriting.com. We have a contact form. Although I really need to say is that I think, self-publishing is a wonderful way to get your work out there. We do only work with traditionally published authors. So if somebody is self-published, we don't have the skill set necessarily to help those people, but traditionally published authors, we can help.
Right. Okay. And then you're coming out with a book this fall called Widow Fantasies. And when I read this, I was starting to worry that you're having fantasies about being a widow.
Yeah, I don't know. I was. That's where this all started. So I don't have the official cover here, but here's the little business card that we have for it. And it is after I'd been, sober for a few years. And it's very common for people who get sober to separate from their spouses after they become sober. A lot of relationships suffer. So after I'd been sober for a few years, I was like, wow, is this what I want? Like, I met this guy and, he was great and, he was pivotal to my sobriety, but, I made these decisions when I wasn't well. Is this the person that I want? And then you have on top of that, the fact that I had many children and I'm not straight, but I did marry a man, and I found myself in this very heteronormative framework where my husband was just as surprised by what the kids got for Christmas as my kids were. All the school permission forms on top of my everyday responsibility and job, I was taking care of all this extra stuff that's called the second shift. I had to take care of all this other stuff, and my husband just really didn't. And I found myself just kind of viewing him as one more person I had to take care of. And I was a little bit resentful. And so I talked to my therapist about it because I was having these fantasies. Not that I killed my husband. I never thought of violence, but just that, oops, what if there was an accident at work? And I would fantasize about what I'd do, how I'd dress the baby in black, how I'd braid my daughter's hair, importing kegs of his favorite beer, all this stuff. And I found so much release and freedom in this act of very subversive and dark act of fantasizing. And I thought, what's wrong with me? this is somebody who loves you so much. You are a sick, twisted, ungrateful person. What's wrong? So I talked to my therapist, and she said it's actually very common for women, especially women who've been married for a prolonged time, and it wasn't that long at that point, it was around nine years, to have these fantasies. And so what that was a signal to me is, number one, to talk to my husband, and number two, to like, let's explore this. Like, and I started talking to other women, and they're like, oh my gosh, yes, I've thought about this too. And it wasn't just me. And I was like, okay. And then I started like thinking about ways to explore how women use fantasizing to kind of liberate themselves from the expectations placed on them in their everyday lives. So that's the collection of short stories in Widow Fantasies. It's all very, very, very short fiction, because while writing these, I had two young children at home, and I didn't have time to like engage in long, complicated narratives. So I wrote very tiny short stories that explore these themes. And obviously I've talked to my husband, and now he does most of the Christmas shopping. So all that is done. But this is why art is such a beautiful way to explore things and kind of work out, like, instead of letting that like turn into resentment, or, you know, I was never going to kill my husband. I said, if I was going to do it, I wouldn't write a book about it, right? Like that like incriminates me entirely. But it was a really great way for me to explore and find community and work through some things, and hopefully some other women, or not even women, anybody, because there are definitely queer stories in here, can find some solidarity and community, and hopefully like healthy ways to deal with what they're feeling.
You said you're not straight, but yet you're married with 4 kids.
Yeah. So, sexuality is a spectrum, and on the spectrum, I am not at the straight end. So I really am not uninterested in what somebody like birth sex is. If I like somebody, I like somebody. So with my partner, he just happened to be who I liked, and obviously who I love. And he happens to have a penis, and that's just the way it is. So, but yeah, I'm not straight, but in marrying someone who, is a male and identifies as a man, I have put myself in a very heteronormative framework where certain things are expected of me. Even recently, I got out of a car and I was wearing ripped jeans. I was with my husband, and a guy turned to my husband and said, "Can't you afford to buy your wife a pair of proper pants?" Because my jeans were so ripped up. And I was like, what? Like, ew, that's so gross. It has nothing to do with, like, I was raging. My husband's like, just step back in the car and calm down, Hollay. Leave this person alone. Ignore it. Yes, it's incredibly sexist, but we don't need to like fight every battle. And so I had to go and like take some deep breaths. And I think it's not just me. There are a generation of women, and I didn't even realize I wasn't straight till after I was married, because I had learned to hate my body so much. There was so much internalized resentment towards the female body that it did not even occur to me to find myself attracted to bodies like mine. So it wasn't until I even got sober that I can remember thinking, wow, I am definitely not straight. And by that time I was already married to this guy. But thankfully, he still falls into my spectrum of desirability. So it wasn't like a game changer.
That is helpful, I guess. That is helpful.
Yeah.
Hollay, this has been a fascinating conversation. If people want to buy your book Fuse, they just go to Amazon or a local bookstore?
Yeah, and same with Rebellion Box, which is published by a wonderful press in Saskatchewan, Radiant Press, and then Gordon Hill Press is publishing Widow Fantasies, and that is an Ontario publisher. So that one's only available for pre-order, and then but you can get them anywhere books are sold.
And I want to get an authored, signatured, inscribed book, but I guess I'll have to wait for that. What a fascinating conversation! Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
We're going to take a short break and come back with some concluding comments in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody.